Good day and welcome back, friends, for another podcast with Kingdom Story. I'm here with my partner in crime again, John. John, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Branden. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, so today's podcast, we're getting into our series, a new series on leadership. We've recognized through the course of our work and through the current state of the world that leadership is a hot button topic right now. In fact, we just see that leadership doesn't seem to be doing very well at all around the world. I don't think people really understand leadership or have a center for how they can model leadership or even evaluate it. So we've started this particular series on leadership that will cover about a dozen different topics. And I think many people are wondering what good leadership is, how they could be a good leader, and what it would be like to be led by good leaders. And there are hundreds of books and podcasts and videos that talk about leadership, and we aren't trying to reinvent the wheel, but we do want to stimulate our thinking, right? And as we talk about leadership, we want to weave together a few things. We want to weave together our personal stories, both John and mine's personal story, but to bring in your personal story, to bring in the cultural story, and at least one biblical story, and to see how these all kind of speak to each other and how God's story really comes over the top as we explore each topic. And each of these leadership topics actually are going to start with the letter C. John, why is that?
Well, Branden, if you know me in my past, back in the old days, I used to love alliterations. I had 7 C's.
The old days.
Yeah. I got converted to story. But most of these C's came from a couple of books on leadership and church leadership. Reggie McLean was one of the authors, Eddie Gibbs from years back, and I've added a few, so that's kind of where they came from.
Yeah, okay. It'll give us a nice thread to walk through. But our first topic of the series is going to be Christ-centered leadership. And John, why are we starting here?
Yeah, good question. I mean, and at one level, when you think about the globe spinning, there's an axis. To understand the axis, obviously, helps to understand everything else. And so I think leadership has to have a center. That's one of my points, is that, and that point has to be something beyond yourself. Your leadership will revolve around something besides yourself. You may have heard the phrase, people are just born leaders, as if there's something just inherent in yourself that's all you need to center your leadership on. But no. Leadership has to be nurtured. That's the other side of the argument, of course. But that nurture has to involve real people and real experiences outside of ourselves. And I think part of that is because more than anything, we are imitators. That's what it means to be human. And so I've got a new grandson named Zeke. And, it's so fun. My son has been remodeling his house. And even at, 1 year old, he's just learning to walk. He's got his own little tool set for Christmas. He's got this plastic hammer. And he's walking around imitating his dad. He wants to do what his dad is doing. And I think we all have stories like that. And so consciously or not, we model ourselves. We center our leadership on these most important relationships we have with other leaders. And that could, of course, be parents or bosses or coaches. I mean, there's a variety of people. And so for better or for worse, these experience with these different leaders plant themselves in the center of what it means for us to be and do leadership. And so basically anybody who wants to, to be an influential leader, you have to, and you have to, center it on something and someone besides yourself. So you're going to look for ways, to find relationships with people who will lead you well. And to the degree that happens, you will center yourself in good leadership. So that's my practical point number one, is pay attention to who leads you, especially experientially, but who are your heroes? I think the second point related to this is that, what we're talking about here is Christ-centered leadership. So we are going to have a center. Well, we say, no, we want Christ to be the center of your leadership. And as a disciple, as somebody who is committed to being like Jesus in every way, of course, my center is going to be Jesus Christ. I mean, it's kind of like the Sunday school answer. It's always the answer, Jesus. So in the first place, you have this Matthew 23:11 that says, "Don't be called a leader, for one is a leader that is, Christ himself." And so as a disciple, my first step in leadership, if I'm a disciple of Jesus, I'm admitting I'm really not the leader.
Right.
That's unique compared to the leaders of this world. And the second place is that Jesus, I have to view Jesus, Branden, as somebody that is not just the distant Son of God, or the compassionate shepherd. Actually, he's the greatest leader that ever lived. Right? And maybe the world doesn't agree with that because he doesn't do this enough or he wasn't that enough or, their standards of leadership are different. But at my core, I'm modeling after Jesus. I want to be a leader. And so I am going to be doggedly determined to know and model the leadership example of Jesus. And so you go through the Gospels, Branden, and you read about how does he deal with his disciples? How does he lead them? How does he lead people that he meets for the first time? How does he, quote unquote, engage and confront and lead amongst the religious leaders? How is he led by his Father? So as we study, and you and I have done this with Kingdom Story over the years, and we evaluate our own assumptions as we look at his life. What did he do as a leader? What did he not do? Who did he lead? What was important to him as a leader? How did he lead differently in different situations? What was the priority for him? What was secondary as a leader? Where did he get his strength and courage? These are the kind of questions, Branden, that we can bring to the life of Jesus in our own journey to make him our center.
Yeah, well, that's really good, John. I mean, not only to learn about Jesus, but certainly making Jesus our center is more than an intellectual exercise, right? Otherwise, it would be no different than me studying like Martin Luther King's life. If I wanted to be an effective leader in racial reconciliation, I need to model after somebody, right?
Right, and there's something again. It's just like if I had given my son Zeke a manual about how to use a hammer, it wouldn't have been very effective. It was watching his daddy, right? And so it's the same thing as what we're talking about here is that what will be center in our life is more than what we believe, but is what we have experienced in relationship. So that's a real question, is how do we live in a relationship with Jesus, who is the only true leader?
Yeah. Just the takeaway and the point, as you've just asked in that question is that leadership must be centered around a relationship, a relational model, with Jesus, where you can model leadership and we can learn about it and experience him as our leader. And it seems like that is a lifelong journey, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, it sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, just walk with Jesus and watch him and then do what he did. And, the WWJD that what would Jesus do? The problem is, in that simple model, is that it overlooks the reality that we all see Jesus, as Paul said, in a mirror dimly. We only see him in part, and sometimes we see him in a distorted way and experience him in a limited way, and so then we can land, on that is what it's going to mean for me to be a leader, and we only take a part, or we take a distorted part of his leadership. And so part of the journey, I think, over time, that journey, it's a disruptive journey. It's allowing Jesus to meddle with my misperceptions and change my paradigms. And in our Kingdom Story on John 13, it's such a beautiful example of how Christ understands that his disciples need a little bit of that meddling. They've been living, with him for 3 years. They've watched him. They've been led by him. And here he is now on the night before he's going to die. Our story starts with him having so many options of what he could be thinking about or doing, but here he is, he's choosing to be with his disciples and to celebrate a last Passover meal together. And so he knows so well, he's already experienced this in their muddling the last 3 years, that they believe that real leadership means, hey, you need to have power and privilege and sit at the right and sit at the left. And at that night, Jesus, knowing this and wanting to give him an experience of Christ-centered leadership, he puts Peter at the end of the table at the lowest position of privilege, with the expectation that he would wash the feet of all the disciples. And what a message that was to everybody, because Peter was supposed to be the future leader of the church when he left, and to say, no, this is my way. Christ-centered leadership means that the first will be last, that the greatest will be least. So, with Peter unwilling to wash feet and to accept a Christ-centered paradigm, if you want to use that language, Jesus begins by standing up, putting the towel around his waist, and washing their feet. And this was shocking. Again, this is probably a familiar story to most of us. Shocking as he was changing the paradigm, the center of leadership. And so he comes wanting to, in some ways, leave them with a way of thinking about Christ-centered, leadership with him at the center. He could have just taught Branden. He could have done an alliteration, the 7 C's, but what he goes, what I need to do is, in the context of my relationship with him, I need to set an example. And only in that can I begin to meddle with their paradigms. And I think that's true for our own lives. Only as we come against our own misperceptions and are led by people who are challenging our paradigms will we be catapulted on this journey to make Christ more and more the real center of our leadership.
Yeah, by washing their feet, Jesus, was upending the cultural expectation. Totally. And I think it's relatively easy to see that as we see the King of the universe kneeling down and washing feet, but there's so much more within this story that also just show. That was more culturally unacceptable for rabbis to do certain things, let alone the Son of Man to do this, and been challenging their expectation of leadership. And unfortunately, they still had this misperception all the way up until they received the Spirit as their Lord. Are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel?
Yes.
Right? They
wasn't easy. Doesn't mean it's overnight. You're right.
Thank you for Jesus' patience in this. But he does upend their idea of leaders being first and to use their power, for their own glory. And I think that's a temptation that leaders face today as well. Is there can you point out another cultural value of leadership that Jesus challenged?
Sure. And again, there's certainly more than 2, and we could spend the whole podcast just looking at this, but it's helpful just to kind of get a little momentum about how this operated in Jesus' ministry. Remember in the story that after Jesus washed the feet of the first disciples, he came to Peter, and Peter says, you aren't going to wash my feet. And Peter, what that means, taking a hard stand. And Jesus could have said, well, gosh, I just really want Peter to like me. Okay, Peter, I won't wash your feet. Or, I'm not going to rock the boat any further. I don't want everybody to be mad at me. Whatever it is, but Jesus does the untraditional thing in leadership is he's willing to be misunderstood. He's willing to be rejected. He says, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you can have no part of me. It's a hard word, a hard truth. And so there's an example of him breaking the pattern of typical, leadership, the practice of being more safe, of making sure that you don't rock the boat, etc. And so, again, as with Jesus, we too face these expectations of our organization or our culture or the norms that say you should only do this as a leader, you must do this, or you be careful not to do that. And these run so deep at times in us because they've been our experience, they've been reinforced, that they're not easy to break.
Right. Eve, we've talked about it already in this. You can know the teachings and examples of Jesus. You can read 1,000 books on this. So we can know it in our head. But if no one is actually living that out in a way that we can see, that we could be inspired by, it's doubtful. Extremely doubtful. I've seen it, a number of times that it won't take root, especially if it's countercultural, especially if it goes against our flesh, if it even puts our self-preservation at risk. John, let's circle back for a second to the point that Jesus, mingles his example of servant leadership in the context of his relationship with those that he's leading, with the disciples. He brings together an inspirational experience with his teaching that they should be servant leaders.
Right. Yeah. Again, we're going back here to the method of how does Christ become the center, of our leadership. And again, I want to just, come back to the point is that we are imitators first and foremost. And that's not only true for Jesus and his disciples. They wanted to imitate Jesus. We too are imitators.
The large point about the reason Jesus put skin on and came down here to be with us is so we could see what God looked like.
Exactly. The whole point of Christmas, the incarnation. Absolutely, Brian.
So what about you, John? Who has been the leader that you have imitated, an inspiration to your leadership? Someone who has helped you make Jesus more central?
Yeah. When I was in college, Brandon, my first Young Life leader was Bob Krulish. And Bob came alongside my life when I was, again, a sophomore and dealing with some major, life issues and challenges, especially related to performance in my studies. And he one day told me that he was praying that I would get a B. I was so driven to get an A, and everything that I did, and he could see that it was an idol in my life, and nobody had done anything but just affirm my academic, success or whatever, and so that was the first time that anybody had spoken a word that would challenge my paradigm and make me think about my sin or repentance or something that had become too important. And yeah, I'm naturally a challenging person, and my personality was easier for me to adopt that, but I don't know how long it would have taken me to discover that aspect of leadership. Asking a challenging question in the context of love, if Bob hadn't modeled that in my life and my relationship with him. And so, yeah.
Yeah, what about an example from your life where a leader inspired you to lead like Christ led others?
Well, I would say one example would be my area director after Bob Krulish, Jim Brown. Jim showed me kind of the opposite, I don't know, the other pole, so to speak, of Bob's leadership. Is Jim always took time to be interested in my life. We didn't just do the task. We didn't talk just about the ministry. He always was interested in my family or in my walk with the Lord or whatever was going on in my life. We always had time for that. And that's another part, that has at different levels in the last 30 or 40 years has just been part of how I've led with others is, I'm interested in getting the kingdom stuff done with them and partnering, but I'm also naturally wanting to know about their lives. And so that's been another example.
Yeah, and that's gone on, I think, and passed on in the generations as you've worked with me and modeled that exact same, leadership trait. How many times I've apologized for interrupting a busy day where we've taken 45 minutes to talk about something that's spinning in my head that just seems, whether there was time or not, you took the time, in order to do that. And at holy interruptions, I think that Jesus tells us to be, or models for us to be ready for. He could be interrupted at any moment, and
that's where the juice was in the interruption. You think about read the Gospels through the lens of the leader being interrupted.
Right.
And some of the greatest leadership lessons come from those moments. So no, I'm sure there's times I failed, but I've really enjoyed that part of our relationship too, Branden.
Well, and it's gone on for me where I've it's not a natural part of I'm very efficient in what I do. I want to get to the task and get it done, but trying to pause and take time to really be interrupted, but also to check in with people and say how's it going in your life before we get to the other things, and to realize that matters, to Jesus, that matters to me, and it matters to leadership that we just take time to check in, with people.
Well, and you think about Jesus living with people, the disciples for 3 years, or the woman in Mark 5, he heard her whole story. There's so much in the Gospels that isn't included, but I just imagine him modeling that. And I saw that in Jim Brown, that Jesus took the time to hear stories and to the details of their lives. Some of us have been watching the series called The Chosen.
Yeah.
It's a great example of the stuff that the gospel didn't have room to include.
Right.
That he just lived with them and got to know them and in their everyday life. So
yeah. Well, as we conclude, I think we have some final thoughts or some summary thoughts about this, and even just some words of encouragement for those that are listening. And that just to reiterate that it will be our experiences and our relationships with other leaders that will be at the heart of our leadership. Consciously or unconsciously, we're going to take on their passions and practices of leadership that will be hard to break. I know this very much in the bosses that I had before you. Before I was walking in the kingdom like this, it's a very different type of leadership, and one I had to get used to, one I didn't quite understand. But I know that had I continued under that, that's how I would be leading. But now, because of what has been modeled for me, this is how I lead.
That's good. That's good. I think another thought, as we go from here is, so if I'm committed to a Christ-centered leadership, where I'm going to pivot around him, then I need to find and look for groups and organizations that have people who lead with the characteristics of Christ. They may or may not intentionally call themselves Jesus followers. You can find servant leaders, even outside the quote body of Christ, but I'm looking for putting myself under the leadership of those kinds of people.
Yeah.
And I think, and alongside of that, on the other side would be is just to be aware of my own life, what I've accumulated over the past, the values of the culture that have affected my sense of what leaders should or shouldn't do. When I realize through the examples of others, through the conviction of the Spirit, or by looking at the life of Christ, if I realize, whoa, I've taken on some baggage, I've taken on the cultural misperception, then here I have a chance to repent. I don't want to live with the constant awareness like the disciples. I'm probably carrying some misperceptions. Lord, continue to challenge me. And then I can turn around and go to the Gospels, read books that are reflecting on the life of Christ or good leadership, and just use my imagination to picture him leading in a way that inspires me. I can bring in my questions. I can craft, in a sense, a growing body of truth around who I think Jesus is, and then experience that in my relationship with him as I let him lead me, and as he leads, I hope, through me with others.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reality here that the body of Christ. I mean, Paul talks about it, that we're all different parts of the body, and I mean all is in all around the world. And so, I mean, the next summary thought I just want to talk about is for you to be well read, and to seek out other those podcasts and those YouTube videos of others and their thoughts and discoveries, and particularly others that don't look like you, that don't come from your culture, that don't come from your background, because they're going to have a view of Christ that you won't, that you possibly can't, because you just didn't experience life the way you did, and you can see things that you wouldn't naturally see. You can learn things, and we talked about it can't just be head knowledge. I mean, so being able to see this model, to try to live this out, to know that Jesus, did come as a Jewish man in the Middle East, and had a color to his skin, but he's also the God of the universe who created all of that, and so we have to do this with others. We have to be taught and led, by others. And so beyond just our podcast or other things that you read, we just encourage you to find other ways of being able to be exposed to the aspects of leadership, and to see how others are leading in their different contexts, because I guarantee that it'll be a huge help to your own leadership.
Yeah, and Paul seems to say, measure everything by the person of Christ. As you encounter things in the world, and even from Jesus followers or whatever, continue to come back to our center, who is alone, the one true leader.
Yeah.
Lifelong journey.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many stories in the Gospels that can help us, learn about leadership. The story that we talked about today, that we focus on in the Kingdom Story, to talk about servant leadership. And I think that really is the focal point of what Christ came to do. No student is greater than his teacher.
Yes.
No slave is greater than their master. But I have done this, so therefore you do that with others. And I think for many leaders, it's a hard pill to swallow, and one to model after. So we encourage you, as we walk this journey, we've not figured it all the way out, and we walk it with you and continue to follow the Master and do what the Master did. And John, do you have any other final thoughts?
No. Thanks for just calling us together around this topic today, Branden. And may the Lord, through His Spirit, lead us to make Christ the hub and the center more and more as we journey. I guess we're all a bunch of spokes. And as we join fellow spokes, so to speak, around the hub of Jesus Christ as our leader.
Yeah, so we thank you for joining us today. If there's somebody that that could really benefit from this, we ask that you share this podcast, this episode with them. We encourage you to like our Facebook page, to subscribe to us on YouTube. Check out our website and just see the things that we have going on there. We'd love your support in prayer. We'd love if there was something other ways you'd love to partner with our ministry and to come alongside and to do the things that we do. We really want to see this story. We want to ignite this idea, but we want to ignite a disciple-making movement, that really takes over the world. Jesus started it so many thousands of years ago, and we want to keep that going. So until next time, y'all, we hope you find your place in God's story.